Montana Territory, June 1879. The sky was the color of ash and fire when Jessa Grey was told she was no longer welcome. She stood just outside the edge of the absolute camp, the same place she had been raised since she was a baby, her belongings rolled in a worn buffalo hide at her feet. Her mother's blood had made her crow, but her father had been a white trapper from Missouri, and now that both were gone, her mother to fever, her father to a bullet, the elders no longer felt bound to keep her. Not with tensions rising and settlers pressing deeper into tribal lands. Not with her pale eyes and copper-brown hair that marked her as different. "You are not one of us," the eldest woman had said. Not anymore. Jessa had not begged. She had not cried. She had only nodded once, deep and final, and walked away without turning back. 3 days later, her feet raw and her throat dry, she arrived at the outskirts of a cattle ranch near the Musselshell River. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a knife her mother once gave her. The horses in the corral lifted their heads when she passed, and the wind carried the scent of rain and sweat and something else, something safe. The ranch was quiet, sun hanging low in the sky. And then she saw him. He was leading a mule toward the barn, sleeves rolled up, shirt clinging to his chest with effort. His hair was the color of wheat in late summer, and his face was sunburned and honest. When he saw her, he stopped, squinting. "You lost?" he asked. "No," she said. "Looking for work?" He looked her over once, eyes flicking to the hide bundle on her back, then to her bleeding heel. "You got a name?" "Jessa Grey." He nodded. "Galen Dorsey. I work here." That night, she slept in the hayloft with a blanket he brought her, a tin cup of water by her side. No one else had come to see her, but Galen had stayed a while, leaning against the stall door, asking simple questions. Where she came from. If she could ride. If she knew how to mend fence. She had answered him with quiet honesty, and he had listened like her words mattered. In the morning, he handed her a shovel. "Boss says if you want to earn your keep, start with the stalls." She worked without complaint. She mucked stalls, patched a hole in the chicken coop, and hauled feed. She was stronger than she looked, and Galen saw that. He watched her from the fence line sometimes, his eyes thoughtful, but he never said much. By the end of the week, she had earned her place at least on the ranch. But not with the others. The other hands kept their distance. She heard the whispers. "Half-blood. Wild girl. She belongs out there, not here." She kept her head down, pretending not to hear. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and turned the fields gold, Galen found her alone by the stream that ran behind the barn. She had her boots off, feet in the cold water, arms wrapped around her knees. He sat beside her without asking. "They will not come around," she said, not looking at him. "Maybe not," he agreed. "Then why are you here?" He picked up a stone, turned it over in his hands. "Because I do not care what they think." She looked at him then, her voice quiet. "Why?" Galen shrugged. "Because I know what it feels like. Being out of place. I was born in Kansas, raised by an aunt who never wanted me. Came out here with nothing but a horse and a name. Took years before anyone let me in." She did not answer, but the wall between them cracked a little. A few days later, a storm rolled in hard and fast. The wind howled, tearing shingles off the shed, and one of the young calves was caught in the gully near the east fence. Galen was already in the saddle when he shouted, "Jessa, you ride." She was on the second horse before he finished the sentence. They rode through mud and lightning, found the calf half drowned in the ditch. It took both of them to drag it out. By the time they got back, soaked and shivering, the calf across Galen's saddle and her hand wrapped around his arm, the rancher finally looked at her with something like respect. That night, Galen brought her a dry blanket and a mug of coffee. "You saved the calf," he said. "We both did." He smiled, not wide, just enough. "You were stronger than any of the other hands. And twice as fast." She looked up at him, something soft in her chest shifting. "You keep saying that like it surprises you." He paused, then reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. "It doesn't surprise me. Just makes me proud." For a long moment, they just stood there, the lantern between them casting warm light across the barn walls. The next morning, the rancher officially gave her a place to sleep in the bunkhouse. The other hands still kept their distance, but Galen did not. He brought her coffee in the mornings, worked beside her in the fields, and always made sure she ate enough. One evening, she caught him watching her braid her hair by the fire, his eyes soft. "You missed them?" he asked. She nodded. Every day. He reached out slow and took her hand in his. You deserve better than how they treated you. Her throat tightened. You think so? I know so. He did not kiss her then. But his hand stayed in hers and she did not pull away. The days passed easier after that. The work stayed hard, but she did not feel alone anymore. Galen taught her how to rope better, how to mend saddle leather, how to fix a wagon axle. She taught him how to track deer by broken twigs and how to twist willow bark into cord. One night, they sat by the fire outside the barn, near the corral. The stars were bright above them, and the horses shuffled quietly. He handed her a small wooden pendant shaped like a horse, carved by hand. She ran her thumb across it, eyes wide. I made it, he said. For you. She looked at him, heart thudding. Why? Because you belong here, Jessa. With me. Her breath caught. You mean that? He nodded. I see who you are. I see how hard you try. And I care about you. Her hand closed around the pendant. I care about you too. He leaned in then, slow and sure, and kissed her. Gentle at first, then sure. Like he had been waiting. Like she had too. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. Really smiling. I never thought I would belong anywhere, she whispered. You do now, he said, pressing his forehead to hers. With me. Always. And for the first time in her life, she believed it. By early August, the summer heat pressed down on the ranch like a weight. Dust clung to every surface and the cattle moved slower in the afternoons, their hides slick with sweat. Jessa had taken to rising before first light when the air was still cool enough to breathe easy. Galen met her outside the bunkhouse one morning, holding 2 bridles in one hand and a canteen in the other. North fence needs checking, he said. You free? She nodded, adjusting the knife at her belt. Always. They rode in silence for a while, hooves muffled in the dry grass. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet, but the sky was already pale with it. Jessa kept her eyes on the horizon, noting where the fence leaned and where the wire sagged. Galen rode just behind, letting her lead. After they dismounted and began tightening a loose section of wire, he crouched beside her, watching her hands work the pliers. You ever think about going further west? He asked. She didn't stop twisting. What's west of here that ain't already taken? He shrugged. Some folks say the Bitterroots are still wild enough. Timber, rivers, good land. Jessa stood and wiped her palms on her trousers. I've had enough wild for a while. Galen straightened beside her, his expression unreadable. Just wondered if you'd want something that was yours. Not borrowed. The wire snapped taut between the posts, humming slightly in the morning stillness. I've never had anything that was mine, she said. Not really. He didn't press. They mounted again and rode on. But when they reached the far corner of the pasture, he slowed. There's a cabin back that way, he said, nodding toward a stand of cottonwoods. Used to be the line rider's before he left last winter. She looked where he pointed. The roof was slouched, chimney crooked, but the walls still stood. You thinking of fixing it? I was thinking you might. Jessa blinked, turning to him. You offering it? He shrugged again, eyes on the distant hills. You've earned more than a bunkhouse cot. She didn't answer, not right away. But she didn't say no either. By week's end, she had swept the dust from the floor and patched a hole near the eaves. Galen brought her a small wood stove from the shed and helped her carry in a cot and a few blankets. He didn't stay long, just handed her a lantern and stepped outside. Before he left, he paused. You need anything, you come get me. I will. That night, she lit the lantern and sat on the cot, fingers tracing the grain of the rough wooden wall. For the first time in her memory, she had a door she could close. The next morning, he left a sack of flour and a jar of lard on her stoop. She found him later by the windmill, tightening bolts on the pump head. You trying to feed me too? Galen didn't look up. Nah. Just don't want you baking with creek mud. She folded her arms. I don't bake. He finally glanced at her, a grin just behind his eyes. Then I suppose I'll have to teach you. They made biscuits that evening over a cook fire he built beside her cabin. She burned the first 2 and he teased her until she threw a spoonful of flour at his shirt. Reckon you'll survive, he said, brushing it off. I've survived worse. He turned serious then, gaze steady. I know. They ate side by side on the cabin's stoop, the sky awash with orange and purple. He didn't reach for her hand and she didn't offer it. but their shoulders brushed and neither moved away. A few days later, a rider came from town with a message. The rancher's brother had taken sick and he needed help moving his herd to a shipping yard near Helena. Galen was asked to go and take 2 hands with him. That evening, Jessa found him in the barn, loading supplies into a pack saddle. "When do you leave?" "Dawn." She leaned against the stall door, watching him coil a rope. "How long?" "For weeks, maybe 5. Depends on weather." She nodded, jaw tight. "I can hold things here." "I know you can." He stepped closer then, rope in hand. "I don't like leaving." "You've got to." He nodded slowly. "I'll come back." Her voice was soft. "I know." He reached for her then, arms wrapping around her waist, forehead resting against hers. "I want more time with you." She closed her eyes. "Then come back safe." Their kiss was quiet, long, and full of everything they hadn't said. When morning came, he was already gone. The days that followed were hard but steady. Jessa managed the feed, rotated the cattle through the low pasture, and kept the younger hands in line without raising her voice. The rancher started sending word through the cook when he needed something done, and she did it without argument. One night, a storm rolled down from the mountains. Thunder cracked over the hills and the wind lashed the trees behind her cabin. She sat inside with a candlelit, needle in hand, patching a tear in one of Galen's shirts he had forgotten in the barn. She stopped halfway through a seam, fingers trembling, and pressed the cloth to her face. Weeks passed. No letters came. But on the 29th day, just before dusk, hoofbeats echoed across the yard. She stepped outside, heart in her throat. Galen dismounted slow, face sunburned and eyes tired. He said nothing at first, just walked to her and pulled her into his arms. "I told you I'd come back." She held him tightly. "Took you long enough?" He laughed into her shoulder. "Had to earn my way back to you." That night, they sat on her stoop again. He told her about the drive, about the calf that broke its leg, the river that flooded, the night he slept in a tree to avoid a bear. She listened, head on his shoulder, her hands settled against his chest. When the fire burned low and the stars blinked overhead, he turned to her. "You ever think about staying here, for good?" She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I thought I already was." He smiled, slower than before, but just as sure. "Then let's build something that's ours." She leaned into him, her voice barely a whisper. "We already are." The cottonwoods had begun yellowing by the time Galen set a second chair beside the cabin's door. He didn't say anything about it, just placed it there one morning before sunrise and went on to the barn with his usual quiet steps. Jessa noticed it when she came back from the creek with a pail of water, its back curved smooth with age, legs uneven but steady. She ran her hand along the top rail once, then sat down and watched the mist lift off the meadow. That evening, after supper, Galen joined her without a word. She didn't ask why he'd brought the extra chair. She didn't need to. He rested his boots against a flat stone and tipped his hat back, eyes on the darkening ridge. "Got a letter from my cousin near Butte," he said. "Says the mining's gotten worse. Took 3 men last week in a shaft collapse." Jessa shifted in her seat. "He's still working down there?" "Not anymore. Lost his nerve after the second cave-in." "I don't blame him. I knew a boy once," she said. "Back in the camp. He tried to run off and join up with freighters heading to the mines. Came back 2 months later, ribs showing, hands blistered raw. Said the hills weren't meant for men." Galen looked over at her. "You think about leaving again?" "No," she folded her arms. "Not unless I had reason to." He nodded, jaw tight. "Good." They didn't speak the rest of the evening, just sat while the wind moved through the grass like a slow tide. When night settled full, he stood. "I'll patch the leak in the chicken shed tomorrow," he said. "Rain's coming." "I'll help," she replied. He hesitated, then reached down and touched her shoulder. "You always do." The next day, the clouds rolled in heavy and low. They patched the roof just before the first drops hit, Galen lifting the last board into place while Jessa steadied the ladder. By dusk, the sky had turned to slate and the air smelled of damp hay. She lit a lantern and set it on the cabin table while he peeled off his wet shirt and hung it by the stove. "You plan to sit there shivering?" she asked, pouring hot water into a basin. "Trying to remember what it feels like to be warm," he said, rubbing his arms. She passed him a clean towel. "You'll lose a lung before breakfast." He dried off, then pulled on a spare shirt from the peg by the door. "You ever get tired of this place?" he asked. "Same fields. Same sky." "I got tired of not having a place," she said, rinsing the basin. "This is better." He leaned against the wall, watching her. "You've changed since the day you showed up." "So have you." "I used to think I was meant to drift," he said. "No ties. No roots. But now I find myself thinking about fences that hold and roofs that don't leak." She set the basin aside. "You think that's a bad thing?" He crossed the room and stood close. "No. I think I want more of it." Jessa looked up at him, heart steady. "So ask for it." "I want to build a real house," he said. "With a kitchen and a root cellar and a porch that faces the creek. I want to plant corn in the spring and have someone to come home to when the cattle are in." Her hands were still, breath caught between one moment and the next. "I want you, Jessa," he said. "Not just here. Not just now. For good." She didn't speak. Just stepped forward and rested her forehead against his chest, her fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt like it anchored her. He held her until the wind outside softened and the lantern burned low. Later, long after the rain had stopped, she lay beside him on the cot, tracing the lines on his hand with hers. "I never let myself think I could have a life like this," she whispered. "You've earned it," he said. "I used to think I had to choose between one part of myself and the other." "You don't," he answered, voice rough with sleep. "You're whole just as you are." She turned her face into his shoulder. "Then I'll stay." He kissed the top of her head. "I'll make room for you in every part of my life." Outside, the creek ran high from the rain and the trees bent slow in the wind. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The first real snow came early that year, dropping heavy across the plains like a hushed warning. By the time the sun rose, the cottonwoods were bare and the world had gone white. Jessa stepped outside, her coat buttoned to her throat, and listened to the silence. The only sound was the slow creak of the barn door shifting in the wind. Galen was already clearing a path from the barn to the well, shovel slicing into the drift with steady rhythm. His breath hung in the air, and his hat was dusted with snow. "You'll wear yourself out before breakfast," she called. He didn't look up. "Then I'll eat more." She walked down to him, boots crunching. "You always this stubborn?" He paused, leaning on the shovel. "Only when I've got something worth making a path to." She stood beside him, her cheeks raw from the cold. "You think the cattle hold through the freeze?" "They're tough. We'll move them to the south shelter before dusk. Less wind." She took the shovel from his hands and started clearing a second path toward the shed. "I'll check the grain store after this." He didn't argue. Just picked up another shovel and worked beside her. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, catching on the ice-laced branches. Galen came in from the lower field with a gash on his hand, a split from a broken gate latch. Jessa cleaned it with boiled water, her fingers sure and gentle. "Hold still," she said, wrapping the cloth tight. "I am." "You're flinching." "I'm not." "You are." He gave a low laugh, then looked at her face. "You always this careful with other people's skin?" "No," she said. "Just yours." He didn't answer, but his hand stayed in hers even after the cloth was tied off. Later that week, a letter arrived addressed to the ranch owner, but the cook delivered it to Galen. He read it twice beside the stove, lips pressed thin. Jessa watched him fold it and slide it into the ledger drawer. "Bad news." "Family," he said. She waited. "An uncle I haven't seen since I was a boy. He's passing through from Dakota Territory. Wants to meet." Jessa wiped her hands on a towel. "You going?" He nodded once. "He'll be in Roundup next week. I figured I'd ride out." She leaned back against the counter. "You think he's looking for something?" "Maybe. Or maybe he's just trying to see if I ended up like my father." She poured water into the pot on the stove, the fire crackling underneath. "You don't talk about him much." "Not much to tell. He drank. He hit. He left." Jessa stirred the water, her voice quiet. "You didn't end up like him." He looked over at her, eyes steady. "Neither did you." The day Galen left for Roundup, the wind came up sharp from the north. He packed light, just enough for 2 nights, and left her with a fresh stack of wood and a rifle at the door. "If I'm not back by Thursday, you'll be back," she said. "I know." He kissed her once, quick and warm, then rode out into the cold. She spent those days tending the livestock and fixing the latch on the smokehouse. At night, she boiled beans and read from a book Galen had brought her weeks before, its pages soft and worn. She kept the fire high and his coat folded over the back of the chair. On the second night, she sat by the window watching frost creep across the glass. The path he'd taken had already vanished under fresh snow. When he returned the next day, horse-lathered and eyes drawn, she met him halfway down the trail. "You're early," she said. He dismounted stiffly. "Didn't feel like staying longer?" She took the reins and ran her hand along the mare's neck. "He wasn't what you hoped?" "No," Galen said. "He came to ask for money. Said I owed it for the name he gave me." She looked at him, waiting. "I told him I'd made my own name since," he said. "Told him I had nothing to give him that he hadn't already thrown away." They stood together in the snow, the wind quiet for once. "You hungry?" she asked. "Starving." That night, she made cornbread and stew, and he ate like it was the first full meal he'd had in days. Afterward, he sat on the floor, back against the hearth, and reached for her hand. "You know what I kept thinking while I was gone?" "What?" "That nothing back there matters. Not anymore. Not when I've got this." She curled beside him, her head on his knee. "I want to marry you," he said. She sat up, startled. "I mean it," he said. "Not someday. Not if things work out. I want to build that house we talked about. I want to wake with you every morning and grow old watching the same hills." She stared at him, breath caught somewhere between fear and joy. "You don't have to answer now," he said. "But I needed to say it. You deserve to be chosen." She reached for his hand, her grip firm. "No one's ever asked me to stay for good. I'm asking." She leaned forward, kissed him slow and sure. When she pulled back, her voice was steady. "Yes, Galen. I'll stay." The fire popped behind them, and outside, the wind carried snow softly across the frozen fields. The wedding was small and quiet, the way Jessa wanted. They stood beneath the cottonwoods just before the leaves let go for good, with frost edging the grass and a blue sky above that hadn't seen a cloud in days. It was the ranch foreman who spoke the words, his voice rough with wind and years, but steady. Galen's hand stayed wrapped around hers the whole time, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles when the silence settled after the vow. She wore a dress stitched from unbleached muslin, simple and strong. He had carved a ring from juniper, sanded smooth, the grain like flame under her skin. Afterward, they ate cornbread and spiced apples by the creek, the other hands keeping their distance at first, until the cook raised a tin mug and said, "To the two who made a home where there wasn't one." Then everyone raised their cups too, and it felt real. Jessa never expected the ranch to become hers in any way, but one morning a few weeks later, the owner rode out to the cabin and handed Galen a folded deed. "I'm too old to keep running this place," he said. "You've been running it already, you just didn't know it. Take it. I want it in hands that'll keep the land breathing." Galen didn't speak for a long while. Then he looked over at Jessa, who stood in the doorway of their cabin, her hands still dusted with flour. He looked back at the old man and said, "We'll take care of it." That winter was hard, but it didn't break them. The cattle held through, and so did the fences. Jessa dug a root cellar with her own 2 hands, lining it with river stones and curing meat by the smokehouse. Galen built a table long enough for more than 2, just in case. They spoke less some days, but there was no need for more. She'd press her palm to his back when he came in from the cold, and he'd pull her near when the stove burned low. That was more than enough. By spring, the soil began to give again. She planted beans along the southern edge of the cabin, and Galen dug irrigation channels by hand, lining them with flat stones. They worked until their backs ached and their shoulders browned, and when they stopped, they sat on the porch and watched the wind roll over the fields that were now theirs. One afternoon, she brought a folded scrap of cloth out from the drawer. He looked up from the tack he was oiling and raised an eyebrow. "You still have that?" he asked. She unfolded the old buffalo hide that had once carried all she owned. Inside it were a few beads, a flint striker, and a single braid of her mother's hair, tied with sinew. "I've been thinking about names," she said. "For the land. For what we're building." He set the saddle strap aside and came to stand beside her. "I don't want to forget where I came from," she said. "But I want to be more than what was taken from me." "You already are." She looked up at him. "Then what do we call it?" He brushed his thumb across her temple. "Whatever you choose." She rolled the hide back up and tied it with a strip of leather. Then we call it Willow Rise. For the place we started. And the place we're growing into. He nodded. Willow Rise? I like that. By midsummer, they'd added a new room to the cabin and cleared a space for a small orchard. The foreman's grandson came to help with the fencing, and Jessa paid him in dried apples and a shirt she sewed from old flour sacks. Galen started keeping a ledger for calf births and weather patterns, which he let Jessa mark with her own notations. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the chickens settled in the coop, Galen found her sitting on the back step, her hands resting on her belly. He stood behind her for a moment, then knelt beside her. You all right? She nodded. Just thinking about whether I'll be good at it. He didn't ask what she meant. He only placed his hand over hers. You already are, he said. The baby came in late March when the last snow was still lingering in the shade. A girl with her mother's dark eyes and a shock of hair the color of wheat husks. They named her Clara after no one at all, just a name that felt clean and full of light. Galen built her a cradle from pine, carved with the same horse shape he'd once given Jessa in miniature. Jessa made swaddles from worn shirts and sang soft songs in a tongue no one else on the ranch knew. When Clara cried, Galen would carry her out to the barn and walk slow circles until she slept again. Years passed. Fences were mended, harvests were stored, and each season brought something new. But nothing shook what they'd built. They hosted a harvest gathering one October, and everyone came, even the hands who once wouldn't look Jessa in the eye. They brought preserves and wool and stories. Near the fire that night, Galen pulled Jessa close and whispered, "You still happy?" She leaned into him, their daughter asleep in the crook of her arm. More than I ever thought possible. He kissed her shoulder, slow and sure. Then we keep going. And they did. Together, they turned hard earth into something living. They raised Clara among horses and river wind, teaching her not just to survive but to love and to stay and to build. Willow Rise stood through every storm. And so did they.